Good morning. Good morning and welcome to our series this summer, our second in July. And it's one that excites me. As someone said, they appreciated the topics that we have done. And I said, well, that's good because you have to listen to the topics I like because I'm the one that invited the people. Meaning, same thing with the songs you sing on Sunday morning. I generally get to choose them. So you either like them or you don't. It doesn't matter because I like them. This is a topic, though, that was brought to us by, and it was one I just barely knew about, but this is what this Sunday was set aside for the Peace and Social Concerns Committee. And Lavera Parker came up and said, hey, look, Gladys and Arlin have presented this story about the Seagoing Cowboys. And boom, right away, I said, why don't we have them come to Buhler to do that? And on short notice, fairly short notice, we got this together, and I'm excited about this. They have presented this in Gossel at the Historical Society there, and they've done quite a bit of research, and I would say eye-opening research, not only for us, but for themselves and their own family stories. So I think this will be really, really good for all of us. Gladys and Gary Voth live in Heston. Gladys will be sharing this morning. Gladys grew up on a dairy farm near Lehigh, Kansas. And after graduating from Bethel College, she taught elementary students for over 30 years, 4 of which were here in the Buhler School District. And they attended Hebron Mennonite. So many of you might remember them from there. Arlin and Moretta Buhler live in North Newton. They lived for a long time in Colorado and thought it was too dull and boring there, so they moved to Kansas. Maybe back to Kansas. Their whole life has been defined by church camping ministry. You can see he's got his Camp Minnesota t-shirt on from the 1950s on. It's taken them from Washington to New York, to Kansas, to Colorado, to Michigan, to Lake Winnipeg. And now they are both here. They attend Alexanderville Mennonite Church, and the Voths attend Heston Mennonite, or Heston Mennonite. So, we are glad to have them here. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, you are the God that calls us all over the globe. You are the God of story, into which you infuse your power, your transformation, your goodness, and you use us to show light to the world. Open our ears now to hear, open their mouths to speak, to show us an example of how this has been done within our own memory. And we thank you that you continue to empower us to keep this sort of mission, this sort of work going in your name. Pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Would you welcome them here with a warm Buhler welcome? Yeah.
I wouldn't know anything about this topic if I hadn't met my wife. Her grandfather was one of the participants in this program. And we have Ray Regier in the audience today. He was a participant in this program. Were there any other either relatives or people here that were part of the Seagoing Cowboy story? Or, yeah, you had a relative, right? John Lawrence, right? Yes. Or the tractors that were sent in the 1940s. Anybody know that story? Okay, we're going to touch on that just a little bit. Some stories are suppressed. Sometimes it's because of trauma. Sometimes it is self-consciousness. Sometimes it's humility. Sometimes the storyteller doesn't think his story is unique or special. Sometimes it's painful to relive and relate difficult incidents. This past, about 2 months ago, a friend told Moretta of his father. His father had served in the Coast Guard. The sons had asked their dad many times about his experiences in the service. He wouldn't talk about it. Late in life, when the family was on a multi-generational vacation, they were visiting Ellis Island, an immigration center. All of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, Grandpa points to the corner and says, "I slept next to that wall." Grandboy had experienced some trauma and had a difficult time telling the story. Many of those stories come to life at different times in different ways.
Jesus way is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me. Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Christ is king in my life now. May his peace.
Cattle boats and tractors. Church of the Brethren Service Committee, MCC. We are going to tell the story. I will talk a little bit about Tractors to Poland, MCC Seagoing Cowboys, Church of the Brethren, Heifer International, Dan West and related stories. My wife, her story is about her grandpa Louis Bridge. Gladys, her story about her brother-in-law Arlin Voth. Gladys, you want to read that?
Here we are in the remote corner of the world, over halfway up the Adriatic Sea. This is taken from his diary. That's how come I know this story to share with you. We are sitting here anchored in the evening of a very warm, sunny day. Everything is so peaceful, yet 12 months ago the horrors of slaughter held full sway up and down the Italian peninsula. A hull of a ship, half submerged and lying not far away from our ship, is still left to remind us of that day.
Service and mission. The person serving and the recipient of the service are both changed people. The volunteers who responded to the challenges returned with insights and vision beyond anything they had anticipated. Service and mission traumatized the victims, it traumatized the relief workers. These friends and family members' lives were changed forever. The stories are rooted in the history of compassion and passion and World War I conscientious objectors. The volunteers who shared in this experience speak of their work with a humble and a warm glow. United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, commonly known as UNRWA, was an international relief agency largely dominated by the United States, but representing 44 nations. It was founded in 1943. It became part of the United Nations in 1945, so it predated the United Nations, and it largely shut down operations in 1947. The project of UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Committee, and Mennonite Central Committee was the sending of tractors to Poland. And we have Albert Dirksen on the left and Menno Fast, who is pictured twice on there, who were two people from the Alexandroville or Gossel area that were in that program. In June 1946, Menno Fast left for Poland as Assistant Director of the Tractor Unit, a joint project of UNRWA and Mennonite Central Committee. The 6-month project to rebuild agricultural technical ability destroyed by the war put him in contact with local farmers and authorities, and he discovered many refugees who had lost their families. So MCC asked him to continue in Poland to work with a refugee relocation effort. He concluded this work in the summer of 1949. Albert Dirksen, in late winter of early spring of 1947, Albert Dirksen was in Poland for the purpose of training and teaching agricultural skills to Polish farmers. The MCC administration project had a clearly defined guidelines and job descriptions, and there are copies of his passport. And one of the things that's interesting to note is that this passport is if properly visaed, is valid for travel in any country except Germany, Austria, the main islands of Japan. Those are islands of South Pacific, and Korea. So that was all enemy territory. Albert Dirksen had to have documentation in order to do this, and I'm sure that Ray knows about the documentation that they needed in order to be a part of the cattle boats. But at the very top over there is documentation in Poland that they would let him in. Here's Polish documentation in English. Here's MCC documentation. And the final one is the city of Hillsborough had to give him a background check to make sure he didn't have an arrest record. Now, for those of you that know Donnelly and Carol Reimer Dirksen from the Gossel area, Albert Dirksen is Donnelly's father. They send International Harvester tractors, Farmalls, H's and M's, and notice they're all on steel. Tractors in 1947 on steel, and here are the plows. We can only guess as to why on steel. One of the guesses is that the rubber supply was so limited that to send tractors on rubber would have been another problem. Farming in Poland. And you notice at the top over there, if I can get this thing there, the first arrow appeared, you have an ox and you have a horse. He's plowing with one horse and one ox. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Menno Fast. A visit with John Fast, son of Menno Fast, about his father's MCC service as assistant administrator of the MCC tractor project. This project was a joint effort of UNRWA and MCC, the cooperation of church agencies, that's pacifist church efforts, and the United Nations is a rewarding fact, and we need to acknowledge that. We're going to acknowledge the cooperative effort again in the next few minutes. Menno Fast and Albert Dirksen went to Poland as MCC workers to enable tractors and technology to be reinstated into the Polish farm life. This led Menno into the MCC Polish refugee work. My North Newton neighbor, Willie Penner, knew Menno Fast and has worked very well. Willie has a remarkable story to tell as a Polish refugee. Menno's refugee work was an undercover work with an underground contacts. Menno had contacts which gave him insights as to which borders of Poland, East Zone Germany, West Zone Germany, and France would be open, and which border crossings were likely to allow the crossing of certain nationalities to move across international boundaries. Peter Dick accomplished this on a large scale. Menno moved refugees who had to move undercover and without being noticed. John Fast related that his dad did not talk about his work because he feared retaliation from foreign authorities. He had eluded political powers and ignored and manipulated many of them. When Menno left Poland in 1949, he was held in detention for 36 hours. While in detention, he was not sure if he would be traveling west and home or if his destination was east and Siberia. Menno's fear of Russian spies looking for him and finding him haunted him for many years. He did not talk about or openly share stories of his Polish refugee work out of fear of foreign political retaliation. There is significant evidence of foreign or Russian spies identifying U.S. citizens and indulging in acts of revenge or retaliation. I am personally aware of several unexplained and suspicious deaths of people who worked in international settings. And there's a whole nother story about Bridge of Spies that they made a movie out of. And some of the spies in the movie Bridge of Spies lived in Salida, Colorado, where we lived for 34 years. And you get close to it without even knowing. Faith the cow. Now Gladys is going to be sharing more of this later on this morning. This is a story of Faith. Faith was a young Guernsey cow, a heifer. Faith was a special Guernsey heifer. She had a job to do. Faith was a heifer with a mission. Dan West loved peace. Dan West hated war. Dan West was ordered to serve in the Army, but when he told the officer he wouldn't carry a gun and couldn't kill, the Army sent Dan West home. Dan West knew there was a better way to settle disagreements. This is part of the same story that we know from Camp Funston in World War I. Dan West was a World War I conscience objector. He was sent to military camp where he refused to participate in military activities. In 1938, Dan West went to Spain as a representative of the Church of the Brethren Service Committee. He distributed relief aid to refugees. Dan sat under an almond tree in a meadow in Spain and had the vision to give cows to refugees and in that way provide continuing aid. Dan West knew there were people in the United States that cared and would share their abundance. Dan knew that giving a family a cow was more valuable than giving them food for a day. Dan West went to his church men's group in Middlebury, Indiana, and told them about the need and vision he had to offer livestock as a relief aid. The first heifers donated were sent to Puerto Rico. The ship left from Mobile, Alabama. When the pregnant heifers produced a calf, the calf was shared with another family. The gift keeps on giving. Horses, sheep, pigs, ducks, chickens, cattle, goats, rabbits were sent. In the early 1940s, Dan and the Brethren Service Committee struggled to coordinate the gathering of livestock, the care of livestock, the transportation to ports, finding available ships, and feeding of the animals. And thus we get into the phenomenon we now know as seagoing cowboys. Send them a cow, not a cup. Heifer Project International, which still exists, is an outgrowth of that. 1945, 1947, there were 7,000 volunteers. And we're basically going to talk a little bit about Arlin Voth and Louis Britch, who is my wife's grandfather. Arlin Voth is Gary's brother. We are to beat our swords into farming tools. I was a high school student in the 1950s. I was taught about how evil and godless the Soviet Union was. Out of the Soviet Union comes a statue beating swords into plowshares, one of the most meaningful artworks and statues ever created to demonstrate the changing of swords to plowshares. Dynamic Christianity. Livestock was shipped to Japan, a World War II enemy, to Italy, a World War II enemy, to Germany, a World War II enemy. It's an intentional effort to build peace. The Seagoing Cowboys were men and boys who volunteered after World War II to tend to livestock shipped by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and the Heifer Project to war-devastated countries. They were students and farmers, bankers and preachers, laborers and teachers. They were brethren. They were Mennonite. They were Catholic. They were Protestant. They were Amish. They were unchurched. Some sought adventure. Some sought to serve people, whose lives had been torn apart by the war. Some wanted to see firsthand what had only read about or they had seen on film. The Seagoing Cowboys needed to join the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marine organization. Their pay from the Merchant Marine was 1 cent per month to make them legal members of the ship's crew. UNRWA awarded them $150 per trip. Trips were generally 2 or 3 months in duration. Church of the Brethren and Mennonite Cowboys were soon recognized by the request to affirm, rather than swear, their seaman's oath. Peggy Rife Miller is the archivist who has done more to preserve this story than anyone else. Peggy Rife Miller's grandfather and Moretta's grandfather served on the same boat. Moretta discovered that in a phone call to Peggy while we were doing this research. And that's one of the books that's been written about the experience. Dan West was with the Church of the Brethren Service Committee. He was a World War I conscience objector. Nearly 7,000 men took to the high seas to deliver livestock via ship on Heifer Project International's behalf after World War II. The deliveries came about through a partnership between the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and the Brethren Service Committee of the Church of the Brethren. Heifer International still gives animals to families around the world, but today most of these animals are purchased in the regions where they are given. Dan West asked, how can we get the heifers to the right place at the right time? Before every step, the Brethren Service Committee consulted with the United States Department of Agriculture officials in Washington, but there was still an unsolved problem because the Allied shipping pool had not announced its policy, nor had UNRWA so. No one could promise, finally, that the cattle that were ready at point A or here would certainly be delivered to point B or there. Whatever is done must be done partly on faith, but that faith must not be a substitute for avoidable ignorance. There is one of the most notable quotes I ran across. Faith never takes the place of avoidable ignorance. If my children were starving to death, I would be glad for someone to act on faith and try to get food to them. When one considers that a good average cow can give about 10 quarts of milk or more, then one cow may become the means of saving lives of 10 children. And you know, a cow doesn't know whether, as on that page, a cow doesn't know whether a baby is communist or capitalist, or what nationality or what philosophy of life. And by sending pregnant females, mares, and cows, they could send 2 for the price of 1. Lactating cows are difficult to transport. USDA recommended sending heifers. We began the trip with 763 milk cows. We delivered 800 cows and calves. And that quote comes from Les Messimer, who was a school administrator just 20 miles up the road from where we live. He was in Buena Vista, Colorado. The purpose of the Cattle for Europe plan Dan West presented to his Northern Indiana men's group was to save children's lives and to help in rehabilitation. The agencies involved extended beyond the Brethren Service Committee to include the Mennonite Central Committee, American Friends Service Committee, and other nonpartisan agencies wanting to help. Dan proposed, no circumference will be drawn by us if the essential purpose fits. Heifer International does not exclude anyone who wants to share in the mission. U.S. military cargo ships. There were 23 Liberty ships that were used that had 15 Cowboys. There was a Type C4 class ship that made one trip that had 80 Cowboys. There were 3 World War I Army cattle ships, and there were 46 Victory ships with about 32 Cowboys on each trip. And the unique thing about this is the Church of the Brethren, by means of UNRWA, was able to correlate with the U.S. government to literally take swords and make plowshares out of them by taking the military cargo ships and changing them to cattle boats for refugees and relief. Over 70 military ships were used, approximately 360 shipments, and this is in a 2-year period. I have ship lists over there and where they departed from and how many. In one Alabama port, there was a ship leaving every other day with 600 to 800 animals on it, with cowboys, with feed, with care for animals. 3 times a week, a ship would leave. This is a massive operation. The SS Boulder Victory, Seagoing Cowboys were used in 1946 and 47. The other one of them was, it made 6 trips moving horses, heifers, mules, chicks, rabbits, and goats across the Atlantic. Seagoing Cowboys, farm boys, feeding horses on board ship. And I usually have the credits for the pictures at the bottom because these come from many different places. Preparing to load livestock. And this is one of my wife's grandpa's pictures, but they have the pens of horses. You have a difficult seeing them, but the pens of horses along the side of the ship. Loading took days. Newly outfitted with stalls on 3 levels and a new ventilation and watering system, the Park Victory headed on down to Baltimore, Maryland. She departed October 26, 1945 for Trieste, Italy, with her full quota of 32 seagoing cowboys, 336 mares, 149 mules, 310 heifers, and 12 bulls. There were 812 animals. It took 640 tons of water for the livestock alone, 35 tons of hay, 30 tons of straw, 36 tons of dairy feed, 75 tons of oats, 3,000 feet of rope, 878 buckets. There's your shopping list if you want to take a boatload to China or any place. Many of the harbors were mined. Underwater explosives were strategically placed to protect the interests of the warring countries and their shorelines. The cattle boats were needed to be guided into the harbors that had mines and armaments in the waters. The cattle boat would wait for a tugboat or a captain or pilot from the local harbor to come and take them through the mines and into the docks. On one occasion, a cowboy wrote in his diary telling of a very close call. Suddenly, a mine appeared next to the ship, so close I could have spit on it. There is no record of any cowboys losing their health or life due to unexploded ordnance on the battlefield. There are many pictures of cowboys visiting former battlefield settings. Foxholes, anti-aircraft guns, tanks, ammunition, bunkers, war remains, unexploded ordnance were prevalent in the cities and in the countryside. The streets of Gdansk showed a lot of devastation. The seagoing cowboys were some of the first civilians to see the devastation of World War II. They were on the European continent within weeks of the end of the war. The destruction of World War II survivors had to cope with. These are pictures that graphically display what happens in the devastation of war. With so many men killed in the war, women did most of the cleanup work. This is in Gdansk in 1946. If the captain liked his vessel shipshape and clean, he would give the orders to keep those stalls clean in whatever way the cowboys could. This is Cowboy Goer and Cowboy Brenneman as they pull manure up from a lower deck. The ship's crew included Arlin Voth, Ray Regier, Milton Schmidt, Ernest Bachman, Alvin Suderman, Frank Schmidt, Herman Schmidt, Ed Pankhurst, and Henry Pankhurst. You will recognize some of those names. Cleaning the horse stalls or dumping the waste overboard. The very first under-livestock trip on the Lukenbach was one on which the cowboys cleaned their stalls. College student Gordon Buhler and Ken Franz worked on the top deck. They recall an incident when they had thrown manure over the rail, just as an older cowboy, whom they will not name, had stuck his head out a porthole just below. The joke of the trip became, "My name is," and they didn't put it in, "What did you see when you looked out the porthole?" Seagoing cowboys. This is from the diary of Ernest Williams. "We tended the cattle twice a day, a pretty easy job. After a couple of days out, we made an effort to clean out all the cages, which was a considerable work in itself. Our method was to take the steel tubs used to wash clothes, which were about 2 to 2.5 feet in diameter, with handles. We put as much weight in as each one as we could handle, and the two of us would carry the tub and throw the waste overboard. We could see brown patches on the ocean behind the ship on both sides, dotting the trail of the ship. Big mistake. The trip was across the ocean was over 2 weeks long. When we got to Europe, they said, 'Where's the manure?' It was considered important fertilizer for the fields. We saw the honey wagons there hauling manure. We had wasted ours feeding the fish." And this lesson had to be learned over and over because the crews changed and the people would leave, and they did not know that when they got to their destination that the people wanted the manure. But that complicates your hauling animals. If you got to store them and their waste and their feed, all of a sudden you got more issues than you bargained for. Manure offloaded from the SS Buchanel Victory, and there you see the wagons, the honey wagons parked alongside the ship. Brothers Jake and Herb Goer served on the cattle boats, and these are their Coast Guard documentation. Jake Goer served on the Rockland Victory. Herb Goer took mules to Greece. And there's a picture of the Rockland Victory. Leland Voth. Leland was the younger brother of Stan Voth. Inspired by his older brother's cattle boat trip to Europe in early 1946, Leland decided to sign up too, expecting to take care of heifers and horses. Little did he know that he was instead going to be put on chick detail, as he called it. Soon after his sophomore year of high school ended, Leland set out on foot from his home in Lorain, Kansas, to hitchhike to Newport News, Virginia. He slept in a YMCA in Kansas City his first night, then took public transportation to the edge of Kansas City, where he set out hitchhiking again. And these are the headquarters of the Brethren Service Committee in Newport News. In 1949, we sent goats to Japan. This is Moretta's grandfather, Louis Bridge, and there's some of his documentation. If you could read that, he had to pay $150 in order to be a volunteer. This is a toy that Moretta got from her grandfather when he came back from Poland. There's his merchant marine card. The documentation was very, very important for them to have passage on the military ships. These are the ships that Grandpa Bridge served on, and a picture from war-ravaged Poland. These are horses in preparation to be loaded. And there is a picture of the Church of the Brethren Service Committee's headquarters in Newport News. Loading horses. There you see the stall. Every horse had to be lifted in one stall and put on board. Here are the pens of horses. Loading took a while. There you see another stall being lifted on board ship. Livestock died. Losses amounted to about 3.8%. And they just disposed of them at sea. There's one story of where a horse was down in a lower deck and they couldn't lift it out, so they had to cut it up in pieces and throw it overboard. Feeding the horses and loading in preparation for the trip. You see the wagons of straw and the horses. English Channel, Cliffs of Dover. That's how you knew you were getting toward your destination. From the end of June 1945 through April of 1947, UNRWA made approximately 360 livestock shipments. That's less than 2 years. The ships left from Baltimore, Galveston, Gulfport, Houston, Montreal, New Orleans, New York, Newport News, Portland, Maine, and Savannah. A few shipments were also made from Brazil. Now, they went to get to Poland, they had to go through the Kiel Canal. The Kiel Canal was in the northern part of Germany. So the ships would come in from England, through the English Channel, through the Kiel Canal to make their way to Poland, their destination. This just gives you a little bit of a picture of what the European continent looks like. I am going to spend this though, because here you see where it was all Nazi territory. The Kiel Canal is over here. Trieste, Italy was up here. They had to go through Gibraltar, across the Mediterranean, around the Italian peninsula, which was the quote we had at the very outset, and end up here in Italy, because their ultimate goal was Czechoslovakia, or some of the inner countries over there. For those of you that are familiar with the Hoffnungsau and Alexandroville story, Shakovka is right up there just south of Danzig, and the Malachna and the Alexandroville village is right over there. Animals shipped included mostly horses, mules, heifers, and bulls, totaling over 239,000 animals. In addition, some shipments included chicks and poultry, sheep, pig, donkeys, jacks, and goats. The total loss of livestock about 3.8%. War-ravaged Poland. Grandpa Bridge took a number of pictures of the area. Here's a picture of a foxhole dug into the hillside. Here's a picture from the Kiel Canal. Artillery out on the battlefield, tanks on the battlefield, people in the foxholes. I think those are people that were probably seagoing cowboys that were doing a little bit of a tour. Anti-aircraft guns out on the hillsides and out in the meadows. Artillery was still there. Battlefield remnants. The trip left a vivid imprint on this 17-year-old mind. Gerald tells, and this is part of another diary, tells of being taken to a battlefield by a 12-year-old guide and recalls partial skeletons in bunkers, a skull inside a helmet, foot bones in rotting socks in foxholes, mortars with ammunition still stacked nearby. Heavy stuff for a 17-year-old's first time away from home. You recognize one of those people, Fred Nisley and Ray Regier. They're looking through a photo book at the top. On the bottom, that's our grandson, and this is a man that lives in their community in Goshen, Indiana, John Nunemaker. And our grandson had a chance to visit with him. This is a sketch that Ray Regier made of the ship that he was on. And it tells about where their quarters were, where the horses were, where the controller, the ship's crew was, and the fact that there was grain on the bottom levels and some canned goods, but on the upper levels he had 2 decks of livestock. Thank you, Ray. Ray Regier, in a visit on March 6th, 2019, said that there were 2 things he remembered about his trip on the cattle boats. First, he commented about the vastness and the extreme power of the ocean and its waves and his 2 weeks at sea. The second thing he commented on was the extreme crudeness and vulgar characteristics of the ship's crew. The time commitment of the volunteers was from 1 month to several months, to most of a year in duration. Some ships took a month to get to their destination. These are Richard Siemens' documentation. This is a picture taken at the airport in Newton, and there are people on there that you will know and recognize. This is December 16th, 1945, and there you can see some of the names a little bit easier. But Ray Regier is standing right there. There was Edwin Pankratz, Garth Friesen, Henry Unruh, Art Decker, Walt Ratzlaff, J.H. Decker, Ernest Bachman, Herman Schmidt, Frank Schmidt, Alvin Schmidt, Milton Schmidt, Alvin Suderman, Ray Regier, Willis Varan, and Arlin Voth, who is standing right there.
Arlin is Gary's brother, my husband Gary. Arlin was 19 when he left on board ship. Gary's was about a year and a half old. And the reason that we even knew about this story is thank you, Ray Regier. Gary and Ray had played golf, and we were leaving to California to go visit Gary's brother, Arlin, and his wife, Norma Jose Voth. Some of you know her with her Peppermint book and Mennonite Food and Folkways books. And Ray said, well, say hello to your brother Arlin. And Gary says, you know my brother? Well, yeah, we were on board ship. What ship? You know, it's important that people share their stories. This is how Gary found out his brother Arlin had gone. Only said, and Ray said, and by the way, asked to read his diary. So when we got to California, both of them needed to be, Arlin and Norma needed to be somewhere else. We stayed in their house. So I kind of looked around for the diary. And Norma had told me it would be a spiral notebook, brown, with a spiral on top. I looked. I said, I can't find it. She said, Gladys, I give you permission to snoop. So I snooped deeply, and I finally found it in the garage in a cupboard way in back with some other things. It was eventually, I typed it up, and Norma then put it together. And this talks about the trip from November 14 to December 13 of 1945, the same time. They didn't get back to the States, though, until February of 46. One of the things that they did was there was a lot of red tape, like you've talked about. And but also some of the things they found interesting is on their way there, they stopped at Pine Creek Church of the Brethren, the oldest church of the Brethren in Union Bridge, Maryland. That was be like 187 years ago. That today that'd be about 260 years ago. They had breakfast with CPSers at the Relief Center in Baltimore. And they had to, again, when they got to Portland, Maine, they again had to go sign up some more papers, more red tape. Reverend Gerhard Friesen said that all this red tape we're getting to is getting our physical exams. They thought that would be all. But he thought the red tape was a sign of all the mistrust and evil in the world. But while they were there in Portland, they also bought candy to eat on the ship, tooth powder, toothbrush, and a checker game. You talked about the horses dying on board.
Yeah.
Alden wrote in his diary how one of theirs, they were on the top deck, but the cord wouldn't reach to where the dead horse was. And they had tried repeatedly to get off the ground. Well, he was sent to the kitchen. Alden was sent to the kitchen to get a knife. It was dull. They had nothing to sharpen it. And his wife, Norma, would say that would be sometimes Alden's favorite story. He was taught at the university level in San Jose. And they would have people over for a dinner party. And of course, in the middle of the dinner, he would talk about his favorite experience. You know, Ray, you've talked about how the ocean was so special. Alden, in one of his diary entries, said, "A little after 4 o'clock today, Saturday, 10 minutes ago, I was up looking over the bow of our gray ship. I wonder if I've ever been inspired to this degree. All around me, sea, water, waves, great Atlantic. Here we are, one silent, gray monster being rocked to and fro. With the exception of 2 seagulls and our silent mass of steel, there wasn't a thing around. The most beautiful tossing sea. The horizon was perfectly even, twilight fading, not a thing in sight. Yet in perfect silence we moved onward, hoping to reach that land that lay towards the other side of the ball, the earth. Everything was peace and quiet." And right after that he enters, "I realized that I would not see the U.S. land again for 2 months." He talks also about the rough sea that they had later on, and he says that one time he and Milton Schmidt were working with the horses and they had the rope, so they decided to take a piece with them so they would tie themselves in bed, because it was hard to work because you couldn't even walk from one place to another. And he said it was very hard to write. There were a number of times in his diary it was very hard to read what he had written because the sea was so rough.
Gladys,
Yeah.
Retta's grandfather also talked about tying himself in the bunk.
Yeah.
The family is looking for the piece of rope right now because it was saved.
Well, Alden then wrote that they decided they were going to wait till it was even more rough to actually use it. What did they? I have off-duty stuff. You want me to tell that now? When they weren't working with cows and hauling manure. You want me to tell about that, or a little later? Okay. When they were off duty, I thought it'd be interesting how he wrote what they did. They would sometimes gather in one room, usually in the 4-bedroom room, and joke and fool around together. Play cards or checkers. If we didn't play anything, we would eat candy, horse around, or find something else to do. Since we all volunteered for this work, I think it helps the morale a lot. Excluding the rough knocks and the storm, it really isn't such a bad life here. Good food, 8 hours of good, hard work, then the evening all to ourselves. The layoff was certainly appreciated. Of our group of 11, plus Ennis Grove, had a Sunday school lesson discussion. 3 or 4 churches from Kansas, a Minnesota church, and Old Menno from Virginia. Sunday school lesson attended by Russell, our waiter, and Scotty, another waiter, who have had no service for years. When they attended Sunday school lesson, it is a bit more chafy. We had a very good evening tonight, a volunteer program. Russell, Scotty, Roderick, and Lest present themselves beside the group of Mennonites. Each had the privilege of picking out a portion of scripture and possibly saying why it became dear to us or something about it. Tonight, fishing's the fad. Milton and I didn't have fish and lines and hooks, so we had a bail hook on end of rope with bailing wire and used some leftover steak as bait. Soon, they gave up and measured the depth of the water. It was about 23 feet, and they were about 40 feet deep, right where they were parked. So they didn't just keep themselves to themselves. They interspersed with some of the others also.
Yeah.
For now, yeah.
Oh, I did it. Oh, good. What a relief it is. Seagoing cowboy crew of the Charles Wooster. They took heifers to Czechoslovakia. Willard Bontrager's. Any relatives? Where are we? Any relatives? Okay. SS Morgantown, 750 horses to Yugoslavia. Willard wrote this little poem, 32 cowboys back at sea, getting homesick as they could be, spent Christmas Day out on the deep and dreamt of home while fast asleep. So wrote 23-year-old Willard Bontrager in his Ode to 32 Cowboys, a poem he presented to the crew at the Christmas program on the Morgantown victory in December of 1946. Cowboys singing Christmas carols on the Attleboro victory after delivering mules to Crete. SS Morgantown Cowboys. Summers, Friedlein, Rakeheim. This is the Herman Depp family in Reichswald settlement. They stand next to the heifer that they received in 1950. These are the animals arriving for distribution at Buhler. Picture's a courtesy picture. The animals are being delivered. 2 heifers arrived at Villa Scott Orphanage in Poland. This is a picture of German children in a museum. And John Thiessen told me this last spring that the university researchers in London, England have inquired about the seagoing cowboy story. 75 years ago was D-Day. 75 years of dynamic Christianity, Heifer Project, and seagoing cowboys. Giving an animal is like giving someone a small business, providing wool, milk, eggs, and more. Animal donations can provide families a hand up, increasing access to medicine, school, food, and sustainable livelihood. 75 years ago, Dan West began outlining a simple but groundbreaking plan to help the hungry. West, a Midwestern farmer and a Church of the Brethren member, had recently returned from voluntary service in the Spanish Civil War, where his job was to provide weary refugees with a single cup of milk. He knew American farmers had resources many others did not, cows and a steady supply of nutrition and their milk. So, I don't know how many minutes we got, but we got a couple minutes.
Raise your hand and I'll bring a mic to you.
I just wonder how everybody got home.
How's that?
How did you get home? Did you go on the ships, or is there
They
another
came
way?
back on the same ships that they went on. The ship was usually there for long enough for them to do some sightseeing and like, if you want to call it that. The other thing that is interesting here, that depending upon the ship, and maybe the port, I don't know, but there were times when loading and unloading, well, loading anyway, had to be with union labor. So the dock workers were the ones that did the loading, the actual physical loading, and the seagoing cowboys did not. Ray, did you help load your ship?
No, I did not help load the ship. Everybody else did that. But a comment on, I forget what it was, but he was asking about going home. The ship was empty, and we left Trieste and went to Naples, and in order to pick up some ballast to keep the ship down in the water, we went to Venice and loaded some sand, and that held it down part ways. Then we went around the boot of Italy to Naples and picked up 100 soldiers to take them. There was room for 100 returning servicemen. We put them, they accompanied us to New York Harbor then. So.
And Alden writes some of the very same things you just mentioned. He says it was a leisurely trip home, 101 American soldiers. February 3, 1946, the Statue of Liberty and the New York skyline came into sight. A USO yacht came out to meet us and provide quite a festival welcome with a brass band playing "We'll Go Marching Down Fifth Avenue." That was to greet the American soldiers who had spent years fighting in the war in Europe.
Yeah.
Got a question right here.
I'm not clear about some of the spy stuff you were talking about, or places they were that they weren't supposed to be. Did the U.S. government knew they were going to places that maybe...
Are you talking about Menno Fast?
I don't know what I'm talking about. That's what you're going to clarify.
Well, Peter, Dick, and Menno Fast knew which strings to pull when. They manipulated the regulations in order to get the refugees out of Europe. And of course, the Peter Dick story has been told many ways in many different forms. The Menno Fast story has not been told as often, except that I heard part of it from Willie Penner. And I've heard part of it from Menno's son, John, just in the last couple months. He knew what kind of documentation would get you across this border on this day. We have some of the same things happening in this country right now. But he was just keen enough to know what documentation to make sure that these people had in their hands, that when he put them on the train in Poland, they could sit in that compartment until the train arrived in France or wherever it was going, because it had to go through former Nazi country.
One last question. Anybody?
My uncle was involved with the Heifer Project, but it wasn't with boats, it was an airplane. And I asked you about it before, and that's all I knew about Heifer Project. I didn't have any idea it was this huge, but thanks for sharing.
I don't know anything about air transport. The unique thing about this story is that Church of the Brethren, by means of the UNRWA organization, which the United States government supported, had access to military freighters in order to accomplish this. In 1947, when UNRWA ceased to exist, the supply of freighters also ceased to exist. At that point in time, Heifer Project became much more intent upon seeking transportation. I mean, that was one of their big challenges. And you all know that Heifer Project is still an ongoing thing, very, very vital. And we have some very high-profile people in our country that support it, celebrities that support Heifer International.
Well, thank you so much. There are so many questions. Thank you for the work, for documenting these stories. And I think one of the things that struck me was these stories are amongst us. And for my generation, maybe the generation more, you're like, whoa, you did what? And those stories, and, you know, whether we're good, humble Mennonites and we don't want to brag about those stories, I don't know, but they need to be recorded. Peter Buhler for the Peace and Social Concerns Committee is recording those stories. So make sure that if you have served in CPS or 1W or any sort of Christian service, you contact him. His contact info is in the bulletin. We want to record those stories for our 100th anniversary coming up here. Do it in an orderly fashion so he doesn't, get dogpiled. But if you don't come to him, we will come to you. So you want to come first to Peter. Thank you for those stories. Thank you for this. And I just can't imagine. We were talking about staying in your beds when the waves are bad. Imagine the cattle and the horses having to stay. And you're talking 300 of them.
Okay, you just alluded to another challenge. The Cowboys got seasick. Sometimes the animals did too. In order to keep the animals from dying, they had to keep them on their feet because a downed animal is prone to die.
Wow. Great stories. Well, we have Cookie Social. We'll come back at worship at 10:40. Cookie Social is downstairs. You can go get some cookies, coffees, socialize. You can come ask Gladys and Arlin and anyone else questions. Thank you.